So my name is Mason. I use both he, him, and they, them, theirs pronouns, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But I'm really happy to be here tonight with you to join in this amazing conversation. It is a really timely and important week, actually. This is known as Trans Awareness Week. Here, it's actually nationally, and tomorrow is what we call the International Transgender Day of Remembrance, November 20th. Which is a day we gather to recognize the many transgender people internationally who have been taken from us because of violence and bias against our transgender identities. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that as well, but this is, suffice to say, this is a really important time to have this conversation within the trans community. Keshet, we are an organization, as was mentioned, dedicated to working for equality of all LGBTQ Jews and our families in Jewish life. This is a little bit about us and the work we do. You can find out more about Keshet on our website, keshetonline.org, or just Google Keshet LGBTQ and we will come up. We do amazing work for education, things like this, but also advocacy, working on the state and national level for LGBTQ rights to ensure that we all have the ability not only to be welcome in our synagogues and our JCCs, but that we can go get a bagel after services. Or we can go see a film at the Jewish Film Festival or things like that. All of that is important work that we understand our role as Jews is to work for the equality of all people, including LGBTQ folks in our communities. Go to the next slide. So a little bit, give you a roadmap of what we're doing here today. The first hour we're going to be here together talking about, wow, that's really small type. Okay, so we're going to be doing some introductions and objectives so that we understand what it is we're here gathered today to talk about and to understand. Then we're going to get into the real, what I call the meat of the conversation, which is exploring identities. We're going to go over the tools and more likely the terms and tools associated with working towards inclusivity for transgender and non-binary folks. And then we're going to get into some recommendations, talk about pronouns and names and some of those real daily interactions that are so important for LGBTQ equality and transgender equality specifically. And then the last half an hour of tonight's presentation, we're going to do those group breakout sessions where we're going to have some more specific questions and stories told. So we are talking about having a conversation and talking about identities that understandably, we don't always have the opportunity to have this conversation. And it can be very personal. It can be deeply personal when we're talking about things like gender identity and sexual orientation. And so I think it's important that we have group agreements of how it is we're approaching this conversation. So just to run over those real quick, this is respectful, welcoming, and educational forum. This is an opportunity for you to ask questions. So please, ask questions. I want to hear from you. I want to hear what's on your mind, what you're struggling with, how I can be helpful. And if I can't answer the question now, if we don't have time tonight, I will make sure you walk away with my contact information so you can learn more. I encourage those questions, but I always say respectful questions are what we encourage. And what does that mean? Well, you know, when we're talking about things so personal as gender identity and sexual orientation, sometimes it can feel a little bit like it toes the line of maybe this isn't a question I feel comfortable asking. Or maybe this is a question I wouldn't feel comfortable answering in front of a group full of strangers. So if you find yourself struggling with, is this the right question to ask, is it not, that's okay. I would err on the side of asking that question, but couching it in, hey, I don't know the best way to ask this, but here's the information I'm looking for. And if you're not comfortable with that, you can always approach me personally later, and we can have a conversation offline, as it were. I ask you to sit up, sit back, and wait. These are two principles I put together. The first is sit up, sit back. What I mean by that is sit up and participate. I'm going to be putting out a few questions. I'm going to have you actually have small conversations amongst yourselves. Please participate in those, but also make sure that people around you have that same opportunity. Be aware of how much space you take up in the conversation and how we move forward together as a group. Again, if you feel like you have a lot of questions or you're taking up a lot of time with questions, you can absolutely sit back, maybe make a note of your questions. I always do it on my cell phone. I open up a notes document and say, what questions do I want to ask? You could do something like that to make sure we all get through the conversation together. And then WAIT, which is my favorite acronym in the whole wide world. Does anybody know what it stands for? It stands for Why Am I Talking? It's a little gift to you. What I mean by that and why I have that up here as a group agreement is as you're asking questions, sometimes this can happen. It happens to me all the time where I start a question and I totally lose track of where I'm at. You can ask yourself to wait. Why am I talking? Where was I coming from? And maybe think about if that question might be better served later on in a one-on-one conversation with me. Wherever you are with this topic is absolutely okay. If this is the most amount you've heard the word transgender repeated over and over and over in an hour-and-a-half session, wonderful, welcome. I'm so glad you're here. If on the flip side of that you feel like you already know everything there is to know about trans identities, please see me after. I do this professionally and I don't know everything there is to know about trans identities. So please, but if you feel like you already know a great deal about this, I hope maybe I'll frame things in a different way, maybe put some information out there about different organizations doing this work, or maybe getting you some resources to talk about this at upcoming holidays and things. So hopefully wherever you are in that spectrum, you'll get something out of this. I ask that you speak from I statements rather than saying those people, they do that, they are that. That feels very othering. Rather frame it as my understanding of this term is, or in my experience, I have, however you want to say it, but couch that in those I statements. And then intent versus impact. Really important core concept as we talk about any marginalized identity, which is sometimes we may make a statement or ask a question, and we don't have intentions of causing harm or making somebody feel marginalized, but those words may still have that impact. Our intent and our impact may not always line up. And we are responsible not only for our intentions, but the impact of our words and deeds. So if somebody, particularly maybe in the breakout sessions, or if you're talking amongst yourself, you may say something and somebody says, oh, that hurt my feelings, or that didn't feel good when you said that. And our initial response may be, those weren't my intentions, that's not what I meant. And that's really important, but it's not just about what you meant, it's about how it was received and how it was heard. And we're responsible for both. So the best way to respond is, that's not what I meant, but I'm also sorry for the impact that I had. Does that feel good? Feeling like we're all on the same page of group agreements? All right, then we were going to move on to objectives. What it is, I asked myself to wait. Why am I talking? Let's give you some objectives so you know why I'm talking. So here are some things that I hope we'll get out of this together today. First is to discuss the diversity of trans identities and experiences and really begin to understand and open up our minds around how many different identities there are under the trans umbrella and how every person's experience relative to gender identity and gender expression is different. Plan ways to be an ally to trans folks. That's actually what you're going to do in your breakout sessions, is really think about allyship ideas and recommendations and thoughts. We'll talk briefly about laws and policies about trans identities and what's happening on the state and national level. And then most importantly, and that's why it's at the end here, providing an opportunity for you to ask questions. I really want to hear from you. I do these workshops quite frequently, although not as frequently now that I've changed positions and doing some national work. But I used to do these presentations about 3 times a week, every week, for about 10 years. So you can't really, I mean, if you have a question that you think you can shake me with, it's not so much a challenge, simply to say, feel comfortable asking those questions. I don't think you can make me blush. I don't think you can scare me away. Again, not a challenge, but I do want you to feel comfortable really opening up and having this conversation. All right, so I want to then frame the issue. I get a lot of questions where people say, like, why are we talking about this? Why is this important? This topic so important? Haven't we already? We've passed marriage equality. We have laws. Like, aren't we done here? And the answer is no. And the reason we're not done here when it comes to LGBTQ equality and trans equality specifically is that while in Massachusetts we have state non-discrimination laws, and in other states we do have really important laws, there is a vast difference between legal equality and lived equity. And these statistics I have up here that I'll read off really quickly get to the lived equity. Just because we have laws doesn't mean that trans people's lives are much easier or that discrimination magically disappears, because the lived equity piece still has to be followed up on. So we know that trans people face an unemployment rate that is 3 times higher than the national average, extremely high rates of unemployment and underemployment in the trans community. 27% of trans people report being fired, not hired, or denied a promotion on the basis of their gender identity. 14% of trans people report being refused medical care on the basis of their gender identity, going to a doctor and being told, I won't see you because of your gender identity, which is something I have experienced myself here in Massachusetts. So these things happen, and not just in states where you think maybe they don't. 29% of trans people live in poverty, and 68% of trans people do not have identity documents or legal documentation that reflect their identity or common use name. We take for granted so many things in our life, like having a license that actually reflects who you are and who you know yourself to be. And that is a luxury that not all trans people have or experience on a daily basis. And these numbers were from the 2015 U.S. Trans Survey, which was done by the National Center for Trans Equality. If you want more information, I'm happy to provide that later about that study. But let's get into now exploring the identities. Let's get into the terms and definitions, because I've already started throwing some of these terms and definitions out at you. So I want to now get into that a little bit more. We're going to start very, very foundationally. We're going to go over terms that you probably have some experience with or feel like you have a really grounding understanding of, but we have to start at that foundational level, first of all, because we need to make sure we're all on the same page of what these terms mean and build from there and build our understanding. So the first term I want to talk about is sex. When I talk about sex, I'm talking about the biological elements associated with being male, female, or otherwise. Biological components like chromosomes, like hormones, secondary sex characteristics, all of those biological pieces associated with being male, female, or otherwise. Now, it's really important from the get-go we start breaking down binaries in our world. There's this assumption that there are only two sexes, male, female, that's it, that's all that exists, that's what's on my license or on my passport is an M or F, and that's all there is. And that is actually scientifically inaccurate. A really important term for you to know relative to breaking down the binaries of sex is the term intersex. So intersex is oh boy, that's small. Okay, I'll read this out. Intersex is a general term used for a variety of factors in which a person is born with a reproductive or sexual anatomy that doesn't fit what textbooks say are classically male or female. Really important term for you to know. Let me also express I am not intersex myself, and so I think it's really important that I lift up intersex voices. There are two organizations for you to know. One is the Intersex Society of North America, and the other is Interact, which is an intersex youth-led organization. You may have heard the term hermaphrodite. We don't use that term anymore. It is not scientifically nor socially accurate. The term we use is intersex, and it actually speaks to a number of ways in which a person can be born outside these binary assumptions of being male or female. People often ask, what is the statistical element, how many people are born intersex? And actually it has about the same frequency as redheads. So it's a very high population of folks that are intersex in the US that we know of, and of course internationally as well. So this is not something uncommon, but is a factor of everyday life for millions of people across the globe. So, getting back to where I was, sex, the biological elements associated with being male, female, or otherwise. And we're going to continue breaking down those binaries. But the next term we want to talk about is gender. Now, people often assume that sex and gender are the same thing, that they're synonymous, and they're not. While sex is about biology, gender is about who you know yourself to be and how you present yourself to the world, or another way of saying that is gender is about sociology and psychology, whereas sex is about biology. And so I actually think it's helpful to break gender down into those two components I mentioned, the psychological and the sociological. So first, let's talk about one component that makes up gender, which is gender identity. This is the psychological element of who you know yourself to be. I use this graphic because I find it's a really great way to understand. It is introspective. Who am I? When I do this presentation for very, very young youths, as I do at times, I talk about your gender identity is who you know yourself to be. And what does that look like? Well, when you close your eyes and you build a mental picture of yourself relative to being a boy, a girl, both, neither, beyond, that internal image of self. That is your gender identity, who you know yourself to be. The other side of gender is gender expression, which is the sociological aspect. Gender expression is how we put ourselves out in the world, how we convey, hopefully, our gender identity. And for many people, these things do align. Your gender identity and your gender expression line up, but not for all people. Gender expression is things like your clothing and your hairstyle, your name, the pronouns you use. All of those things that tell people around you your gender is actually your gender expression. It is the expression of gender. And for some people, it may not align. Your gender identity may not align with your gender expression. So for instance, if somebody knows themselves to be, we'll use the term boy, a young person knows himself to be a boy, and yet is not safe communicating that to the world around him. Perhaps he was assigned female at birth. He knows himself to be a boy, but if he starts expressing himself as a boy, he might get kicked out of his home. He might lose a scholarship. He might lose a job, lose your family. So for many people, we hope that gender identity and gender expression can align, but for some people it's not safe, and for others, we still might be figuring it out. And so I think it's really important that we talk about these things separately and distinctly, because they are separate and distinct. So the next term I want to talk briefly about is sexual orientation, because sometimes this all gets caught up together, where people say, oh, gender identity, that's about being gay or lesbian, right? Not quite. Because we talk about the LGBTQ umbrella, LGBTQ standing for lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, and that Q stands for queer and or questioning. And oftentimes those are bundled up together in a way that people assume it's about sexual orientation. But sexual orientation and gender identity are very different. A friend of mine who's an author and has written extensively on this talks about gender identity is who you go to bed as, and sexual orientation is who you go to bed with. Now, I don't love the emphasis on the bedroom, simply because I've been married for over 10 years and I know the fact that my partner is more than just what happens in a bedroom. But it does get that point across, that gender identity is about who you know yourself to be. Sexual orientation is about your relationships. People you want to be in relationship with, people who you don't want to be in relationship with. All of those relationship aspects are about your sexual orientation. And let me also say that there's more than just being gay or straight. Again, breaking down binaries. There are so many other sexual orientations out there that we can talk about briefly, because time is a thing. But terms like pansexual. Have folks heard the term pansexual before? Pansexual means that you are attracted to multiple gender identities and gender expressions. Asexual, somebody who doesn't have a sexual attraction to other people, is also asexual orientation. And so it's important that we understand and break down the binaries around sexual orientation, but also remember that sexual orientation is different than gender identity. So let's actually now go ahead and let's talk about the word queer. It's a term that I've already mentioned. It's the Q in the LGBTQ. And it's a term we hear more and more relative to sexual orientation and gender identity. But what does it actually mean, and is it okay to use it? What I always talk about when it comes to language, whether you're using the word queer or gay or lesbian or bisexual or straight or heterosexual, we, in order to be more accommodating and more accepting and inclusive, I always say it's better to reflect language than prescribe it. So when I talk about the word queer, I never use the term queer to describe somebody's gender identity or sexual orientation unless they use that word to describe themselves. Because I also know that the word queer has such trauma behind it. There are many people, including myself, where we have experienced a great deal of bias and violence centered on the word queer. And there are many people, also including myself, working to reclaim and take the trauma and violence away by saying, you can't hurt me with this word because I'm going to use it for myself. And so I would always say, when it comes to using the word queer, it is okay to reflect that back. Where somebody says, I am proudly queer, it's okay to use it. But where somebody says, I don't like that word, then I wouldn't use it. And that's why I don't generally use the word queer as an umbrella term. I use LGBTQ as the umbrella term because it is, again, a little bit more accommodating, more inclusive and accepting to use that acronym rather than the word queer. But a quick story about the word queer. At a time when I was actually struggling with it, where I had recently experienced a hate crime where the word queer was used, I was in this struggle of, I hate this word, I can't use it, I never want it used, why would anybody want to use it? It is so violent. And so as a very out and proud geek, I did what every geek does when they're struggling with something, or at least what this geek does when I struggle with something. I went to my safe place, which was the library. I went to the library and I pulled out the Oxford English Dictionary and I looked up the word queer. What does it mean? And what does this amazing tomb of English language, what does this say the word queer means? And the first word relative in the definition, the synonym used to define the word queer was unique. To be queer is to be unique. And there's something really beautiful about that. My gender identity, my sexual orientation is unique to me. It is queer. And that was a turning point for me, and I know for others, thinking about that as the synonym for the word queer can be a turning point as well. It is not inherently a bad word unless it is said with bad intentions. And so that is why I have now worked to reclaim the term for myself and why I believe that it can be reclaimed, but I don't want to assume that's true for all people. All right, so we've talked about sexual orientation, we've talked about gender identity. Let's now get into something deeper, which is let's define the word transgender, because I haven't done that yet. And like I'm here talking about trans identities, I should maybe define the word. But it's helpful to have this background and foundational information about what is sex, what is gender identity, what is gender expression, because all of that informs the definition of the word transgender. So the transgender is also an umbrella term. It encompasses a lot of identities. But the umbrella definition is transgender describes somebody whose gender identity or gender expression differs from society's expectations based on the sex we are assigned at birth. That's a whole lot of words. I'm going to repeat it one more time. Somebody who is transgender means it's somebody whose gender identity or gender expression differs from what society expects it to be based on the sex we were assigned at birth. Now, some people boil that down and say somebody whose gender identities differs from their sex. But gender identity and sex are different, so everybody's gender identity differs from their sex. So it's important that we throw in that somebody whose gender identity or gender expression differs from society's expectations based on the sex we were assigned at birth. Because when an individual is assigned male at birth, society assumes that that person is going to grow up to be a boy and a man, and that he's going to express himself in a masculine way. But that's not always true, and that's why we have the term transgender. You'll also hear me use the term trans. What's the difference between trans and transgender? There is none. No, so many people are moving away from transgender as the umbrella term and into the term trans as the umbrella term, especially when you type this all day, every day. It's really helpful to just shorten that down. But actually, many people, we feel that trans feels a little bit more inclusive because when you talk about transgender, there is the emphasis on gender doesn't always describe everybody's true lived experience. One person described this to me, she said, she was a trans woman, who said, it isn't about my gender. I know my gender. What it's about and what the problem is people's assumption based on my sex at birth. So it's not about gender, it's about sex. So that's one person's response or thoughts on this. So I use the term trans predominantly. You'll see both written and both of them used as umbrella terms. So one more time, trans or transgender means somebody whose gender identity or gender expressions differs from society's expectation based on the sex we are assigned at birth. But if this is an umbrella term, what's under the umbrella? Let's get under that umbrella. But I actually think a better place to start, I contradict myself, a better place to start is what's not under the umbrella. So the term that's not under the umbrella, we use the term cisgender, or shorten that to cis, C-I-S. Cisgender is a term we use, if you can hit one more time, cisgender is a term we use to describe somebody who isn't transgender. So I'm a real geek, so I throw Star Wars up there, and Harry Potter and Marvel Universe all at the same time. I'm outing myself as a total nerd. But cisgender is a term we use to describe somebody whose gender identity or gender expression aligns with society's expectations based on the sex they are assigned at birth. That's a lot of words to describe a fairly simple concept, which is there is that alignment between society's expectation and the sex they were assigned at birth. How do we use this term? I'll use, with her consent, my spouse is a cisgender woman. She was assigned female at birth. She identifies as a woman. She expresses herself femininely. She identifies and is a cisgender woman. Although if anybody wants to get into a gendered analysis of Hermione Granger in the Harry Potter series, talk to me afterwards. We can go there. I can do that. But that's Trans 201, not Trans 101. Also, gender identity in the Star Wars universe or Marvel universe. We can go all those places. It's great. So cisgender is what's not under the trans umbrella. So now let's get under the trans umbrella. And the first term we'll talk about is actually a collection of terms: transgender women, trans women, or trans feminine. All of these terms are used to describe somebody who was assigned male at birth, a woman who is assigned male at birth but identifies, knows herself to be, or lives as a woman. And there's a lot of trans women who are out in media today. Laverne Cox, she's amazing. I got to meet her last year. She's great. For folks who don't know, Laverne Cox is an actress who plays a trans woman on the show Orange is the New Black and has been on a number of other shows. She doesn't just play a trans woman on TV. She is herself identified as a trans woman. Why do we have all these different terms? Well, like I said, all of these things, terms about identity should always be reflective and not prescribed. So some people may feel passionately about using the term transgender woman. Others may feel better about trans woman. Others may feel better about trans feminine. All of them are used to describe a family of identities where somebody, a woman who was assigned male at birth but identifies, knows herself to be, and lives as a woman. The next family of terms, we're going to stick on the binary for a little bit, and then we're going to throw the binary out the window, because that's what we do. So the next up is transgender men or trans masculine. These are terms used to describe individuals, men who were assigned female at birth but identify, know themselves to be, or live as men. Now, coincidentally, there aren't as many trans masculine or trans men in the media, and there's a whole, that's Trans 201 as well, of talking about the sensationalization of trans bodies. Separate conversation. But we do have some amazing hometown heroes actually here in Massachusetts. Skylar here is a trans man who swims on the Harvard men's team and is one of the first out trans men to compete as a man at the collegiate level, which is really important and awesome, and he's a hometown hero. But these are all individuals, again, trans men used to describe individuals who were assigned female at birth but identify, know themselves to be, and live as men. Now, when I first started doing this work about 15 years ago, a lot of conversation about trans identity ended here. And trans men, trans women, all done, yay. No, that is not where this should stop, because there are so many other identities under the trans umbrella for us to understand, learn about, and explore. And many of those are under what I would call a sub-umbrella of the trans umbrella, and that term we use is non-binary identities. So non-binary identities are used, the term is an umbrella term used to describe individuals who do not identify or know themselves to be, or whose gender identity or expression doesn't align on that binary. Not a man, not a woman, not a boy, not a girl, not masculine, not feminine, but beyond that binary. Maybe both. Maybe neither, maybe beyond, maybe fluid between. But if we can hit it one more time, this cartoon gets to it a lot faster than I can. Are you a boy or girl? No. No. And so non-binary identities can look and can be experienced and be kind of utilized in so many different ways to describe so many different folks. And so I want to get a little bit deeper into non-binary identities. So here's a quick definition, meaning a person identifies as neither or both man or woman, masculine or feminine, boy or girl. You could be both, you could be neither, fluid between them. Some of the identities under this sub-umbrella we can talk about, go ahead and hit one more time. Identities can include genderqueer. Genderqueer is an amazing term. We can go back to that definition of the word queer and say that we would define genderqueer as somebody whose gender is unique to them. Not man, not woman, but unique to that person. Gender nonconforming means somebody who doesn't conform to society's expectations of masculinity or femininity. Third gender, we have man, woman, we have third gender beyond that. Agender, somebody who doesn't have a gender identity according to the very binary language we utilize in predominantly English-speaking areas. Gender fluid, meaning somebody whose gender identity or gender expression may change and shift and adapt over time. People may be gender fluid from day to day, week to week, month to month, or situation to situation. There are many people who identify as gender fluid simply because I can't go to work in my true, authentic gender identity because I might be fired. So I am fluid. Maybe I present one way at work and my gender expression is different when I am at home because I'm safe there. And that's some of that gender fluidity. Others may be gender fluid simply because, you know what, today I feel more masculine, today I feel more man, tomorrow I may feel differently, and that's okay. And there are so many other terms. I guarantee you, since I started talking half an hour ago, there are like 10 new terms to describe non-binary identities, 10 of them on Twitter, the rest on Tumblr. And that's awesome. Can I just say that? Like, I love the way that the language we're talking about and the language we utilize to talk about gender is shifting and adapting and changing. And I know a lot of folks find that really scary. There's so many new terms. How do I keep up? These terms were not around when I was growing up and not something I learned. And that's great. We didn't have the term Google 30 years ago, and now it's a noun and a verb. Are we afraid of Google? No. Well, okay, actually, sort of. But we use Google because it's a great tool. So I am definitely a student of language. I find linguistics to be an amazing area of study because language is something that is always growing and shifting and adapting to help us understand the world around us. That is the function of language. And so, yes, we may not have had the term genderqueer or non-binary gender identities or gender fluid, 20 years ago. It doesn't mean the concept didn't exist. Now, it's really important, a lot of folks do come to me and they say, well, but this is all so new. This is such a, legit has had this statement the other day of, this is such a millennial thing. No, trans and non-binary identities are not new. The language we are using to understand them may be newer to us, but it doesn't mean the concept is new. I often, when I do these workshops, I actually discuss some of my own study into Torah and Talmud. And the Talmud recognizes not 2, not 3, but 6 different genders. If the Talmud can understand 6 different genders, I think that's a pretty good example of how this isn't new. This has been around for as long as people have been trying to put our experiences into boxes and binaries. There have been those fighting against those boxes and binaries. And that's the beauty of language and trans identities. And yes, I have my little Steven Universe gif of, are you a boy or a girl? I'm an experience. I'm so much more than either of those words can encompass or describe. Some quick youth-focused terms that we hear more and more. One is gender expansive, youth who are gender expansive, who are growing their awareness of not only the world around them, but gender and their identity. And then by far, my favorite non-binary term is gender creative. And it's predominantly used for trans youth who are creating themselves. And isn't that what all of us are really doing, is creating ourselves and building ourselves into our final form. But for youth, I actually was over the weekend working with some gender creative youth, and knowing that I was going to be doing this today, I asked them, I said, how would you define gender creative or gender expansive? And one of the young people looked up at me like I was an idiot, as only youth can. And they said, it just means we color outside the boxes. And then went back to whatever it was they were doing. I was like, that's what it is. Okay, great, fantastic. So that is from the mouths of gender creative youth. They color outside the binary boxes of boy or girl. And there's something infinitely creative about that, isn't there? So those are some helpful non-binary identities or terms and information about non-binary identities. It's important to understand that you will never meet two genderqueer people who look or act or identify in the same way, because it is inherently about self-identity and self-awareness, and we are all unique, and that goes for gender as well. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm a pretty visual person, and so these concepts can feel just like that. They feel like concepts, and it's harder to really maybe put our finger on it, especially in a visual way. I have a handy-dandy tool to help with that. I'm going to introduce you to my bestest friend in the whole wide world, who is the gender unicorn. So no LGBTQ workshop is complete without a unicorn or a rainbow. I'm going to hit both in one slide. All right, here's the gender unicorn. This is an amazing tool that was developed by and for trans youth to help us describe and understand gender identity and sexual orientation. So if it's a tool, how do we use this tool? First of all, you can use Google and search the gender unicorn, and I recommend printing it out. Yes, we're saving trees, but this is a helpful one to print out. So you print out the gender unicorn and you grab a pencil. Never fill this out in pen, because anything can change. Anything, and that's beautiful and wonderful, and that is the freedom and independence to declare who we are. So you take your pencil, and you take your hard copy of the gender unicorn, and you look up here and it says gender identity. And you say, what is my gender identity? Well, gosh darn it, I spoke to Mason 2 days ago, and I don't remember what gender identity means, but it's also a key. Gender identity, you can use the unicorn here as your key. Your gender identity is who you know yourself to be. And so that's why it's in the thought bubble. You have the rainbow, again, rainbow, LGBTQ. Gender identity is who you know yourself to be internally. So you say, okay, now I remember, because I used the gender unicorn as a key. What is my gender identity? And then you look below it and you see 3 lines and go, what? I'm confused. How do I fill this out? That's why Mason is here. So you say, the 3 lines here, early iterations of this had just 1 line. And on one side it said man, and on the other side it said woman, and you charted yourself in the spectrum between man and woman. But that is inherently binary thinking. What that communicates is that man and woman are opposites. And on one end of the spectrum is man, and on the other end of the spectrum is woman, and these things are opposites. I'm going to break your brain here. They aren't opposite. The opposite of being a man isn't being a woman. And the opposite of being a woman isn't being a man. The opposite of being a woman is not being a woman. And the opposite of being a man isn't being a woman. The opposite of being a man is not being a man. And so if you use that spectrum, these things are opposites. We use 3 lines to communicate that they are not opposites. So you look at this first line, it says woman or girl. I actually wouldn't use the terms female or male to describe gender identity. Small edit on the gender unicorn, hopefully to be fixed in future versions. So do I identify as or know myself to be a woman or a girl? You could say yes. You could say meh. You could say no. That doesn't automatically make you a man. It just means you're yes, meh, or no on being a woman. So I can use myself as an example. I do not identify as a woman or girl, so I would say no. And I would take my pencil and check the kind of no end of that spectrum. Next line, it says, are you a man or boy? And I'm kind of meh on that, to be totally honest with you and open about my gender identity. And to give you a little clarification on that, I use, I mentioned earlier, both he, him, and they, them, theirs pronouns, which we'll talk about in a moment. My identity is non-binary transmasculine. My gender expression is masculine. I present myself in a masculine way to the world, although a few weekends ago for Halloween I did a pink glitter beard, a little less on the masculine spectrum. That's okay. But my gender identity is non-binary. I don't identify as a man or boy. Those terms don't really work for me. I'm originally from Southern California, so like guy and dude, yeah, sure. but man doesn't work to describe me. So I'm kind of meh on this spectrum. Then you go down to other genders, because we know that being an other gender, third gender, or gender fluid, or gender queer, doesn't mean you're somewhere between man or woman. It means you are beyond that. And so I would also check, probably on the higher end for my gender identity, non-binary. So that's my gender identity. Next up is gender expression. All right? What is gender expression again? We use the green dot as the key. It is all those external elements around the gender unicorn. Your clothing and mannerisms, all those socially prescribed elements associated with masculinity or femininity, that is your gender expression, also known as gender presentation. So here we have feminine. So my gender expression today, really not feminine, so I would say no. More masculine, yeah, I'd probably check the higher end of that. Other or non-binary, I would check a little less, depending on where I'm feeling in the moment. And that's my gender expression. More trans-masculine, I express myself in a masculine way, and that is my gender expression. Next up, we have your sex assigned at birth. So it has the little double helix, DNA double helix, to talk about, remember, the biological elements associated with being male, female, or otherwise. And so it lines up with the gender unicorn, and you see female, male, or intersex, or other. I was assigned female at birth, so I would check that box. Now we're going to talk a little bit about sexual orientation and just touch on that topic a little bit more, because this breaks out the difference between sexual attraction and romantic attraction. And it's important to understand that these also are different and distinct. Just because you are sexually attracted to somebody doesn't mean you want to be in a relationship with that person. And so that's the distinction between romantic or emotional attraction. You could say, this is somebody I want to be in a relationship with. This is somebody I want to spend a significant amount of time with. And that may be different and distinct than somebody that you have a sexual attraction to. Now, this actually, recently in a workshop, this really hit home for me. I was talking with somebody, and they said, I totally get it. This person said, I identify, I am a heterosexual man. I am attracted to women. But when I was younger, when I was in my late teens, early 20s, I was sexually attracted to everybody because I wanted that experience. I wanted to physically connect with people. And so he said, I only wanted to be in relationships with women, but I was interested in physical attraction to many other people beyond women. He said, now he said, I've been married to a woman for a very long time. I am romantically and sexually attracted to her, and that also gets to how this can change. Things like sexual attraction and romantic attraction, they can change over time, and that's okay. We all change. I'm not the same person I was 10 years ago, and I don't want to be the same person I was 10 years ago because I've learned so much more. And so these things, again, fill it out with pencil because it can change. So the sexual attraction, I identify as queer and bisexual, so I would draw what I call the queerest straight line across all three. It's a pun. It's queer and straight. Yeah, okay, cool. Okay, great. It was a bad dad joke. I know. It's fine. It's fine. I can feel my spouse groaning from miles away. So that's how I would describe my sexual and romantic attraction, and that works for me. So this is, like I said, the gender unicorn. You can just simply Google gender unicorn, and they will come up. But it's a really fantastic tool to help us understand our identity, but also remember, it's not just trans people who have a gender identity or gender expression. We all have a gender identity and gender expression. And the gender unicorn gets to that. We all have a sexual orientation. It's not just gay and lesbian people or bisexual or queer or pansexual or asexual people who have asexual orientation. We all do. And this is a helpful tool to communicate that, and also where people may be struggling with their gender identity or sexual orientation. For those of us who maybe need to see it written out, need to interact with it in a physical way, this can be a great tool to help facilitate that. So I have about 10 minutes left. I want to now get into pronouns, names, and some quick recommendations, and then we'll do the breakout sessions. So let's start with pronouns. Pronouns are one of those things where it's really important to understand. In order to be a trans ally, we have to understand what pronouns are, why they're important, and why and how we respect those pronouns. When we talk about non-binary identities, where somebody doesn't identify as he or she, what pronouns do we use? We do have gender-neutral pronouns available to us, and this is becoming more and more well-known, but we're going to talk about it a little bit more in depth. So I told you I love linguistics and language, so I put this into a chart. It's handy-dandy. So the first two lines here are binary pronouns. He, him, and his, she, her, and hers, himself, herself. Those are what we would say are traditionally masculine or feminine pronouns in the English language. They communicate something about somebody's gender identity or gender expression in a what we assume to be binary way. The three bottom lines are non-binary or gender-neutral pronouns that are available in the English language. Now, this is not an exhaustive list. There's actually over 30 gender-neutral pronouns in the English language alone, and that list is growing every day. Again, amazing adaptive language. But these are what I would say the three most common use gender-neutral or gender-inclusive pronouns. The first of those three is they, them, and theirs. They, them, theirs as a single person pronoun. So I would say 9 times out of 10 when I do this workshop, there's somebody, and I'm not going to like call out names or make eye contact with you. I'm going to like do that. There's somebody who says, well, that's fine and I'm good with being inclusive, but it's not grammatically correct. I get it. I understand. I studied English. I understand why grammar feels like such a hurdle in understanding non-binary pronouns. To which to say it is not grammatically correct, it actually is grammatically correct. The Webster Dictionary, the Oxford English Dictionary, and many, many grammar and writing guides, including the legal writing guides, journalistic writing guides, have all recognized that they, them, theirs can be utilized for a single person in a gender-neutral way. So grammar says it's okay. Now, usually that same person says, okay, well, those guides may say it's okay, but it doesn't sound right. It doesn't sound right to use they or them to describe a single person. It sounds like you're talking about a group of people. My next response is, if they, them, theirs as a singular pronoun doesn't sound right, then you're actually telling me that Shakespeare doesn't sound right, that Emily Dickinson doesn't sound right, that Emily Bronte doesn't sound right, because these are all authors that we study in the great, English language literary giants who have all used they, them, theirs as a singular pronoun. At least once. I actually spent many years studying Shakespeare. We can debate whether Shakespeare actually wrote Shakespeare, but Shakespeare actually used they, them, theirs as a singular pronoun in almost every one of his plays. Emily Dickinson did it. Walt Whitman did it. So it does sound right because you've never noticed it before and it sounded just fine. So we're going to continue with this theoretical conversation of, okay, well, it may be grammatically correct, and maybe some authors do it, but I don't know that I could ever use they, them, theirs as a singular pronoun. It doesn't sound right coming out of my mouth. I struggle with it. And I absolutely hear that, and I want to respect that, but I guarantee you, you have used they, them, theirs as a singular pronoun at least once, probably in the last month, if not the last week. By the way, actually, when I was coming in, I noticed somebody left their sweater on the chair out here. If anybody's missing their sweater, can you let them know, and I'll hold on to it for them, and they can come grab it from me later. Nobody actually left their sweater, because it would be really cold. But I'm using gender-neutral pronouns to describe the owner of that sweater because I don't know who owns it. We do this with items, with elements where we don't know what pronouns to use. I don't know if this was her sweater or his sweater, and our language has just grown to adapt and evolve to say their sweater. Now, we know that that sweater doesn't belong to a group of people. Actually, no, I have a sweatshirt that belongs to me and my spouse, so, okay, sweaters can belong to a group of people. But you get the point that the sweater doesn't belong to a group of people. It belongs to a singular individual, but we don't know who that is, and so we default to they, them, theirs pronouns. So this has been a 3-part dissertation of why they, them, theirs is grammatically correct, because the guides say it so. Shakespeare, Emily Dickinson, and many other literary giants have utilized it. You've used it at some point or had heard it used in some point and not noticed. But the fourth part about this four-part dissertation on why they, them, theirs pronouns are grammatically correct have nothing to do and actually supersede all of that. It's about respect. If somebody says, these are the pronouns I use, please respect them, we do. Just like if somebody says, comes to you at work and says, I need tomorrow off, it's a major holiday in my religion. We don't question that person. What religion is that? What's the holiday? Where did it come from? What does it mean? We don't question that. Because to be inclusive means we accept people and respect people based on the needs and what they articulate is important to them. So even if we don't care about the grammar guides or Shakespeare or any of that, we respect people and the pronouns they use. So these other pronouns that are listed here, Z here and here's, I've seen Z spelled X-E and Z-E, is a gender-neutral pronoun. People often come to me and say, well, you can't just make up pronouns. The English language makes up words all the time. See Shakespeare. See Google. We make up words all the time that's to describe the world around us. So yes, we can make up pronouns, but actually Z here and here's is also recognized by Webster and the Oxford English Dictionary as a gender-neutral pronoun and has been around for over 30 years. It's not something I came in here and made up and said, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to make up pronouns today. I did not do that. It has been around for many, many years. The last option here is just using somebody's name. If somebody says, I don't want any pronouns used, then just use that person's name. Rather than saying, he went to the store, I would say, I met my friend Alex. I went over to Alex's house. Alex's roommate was there. Alex's roommate and I, we all went out for a beer because I owed them for getting their pronouns wrong, getting Alex's pronouns wrong. See, now I owe them another beer. So I got Alex's pronouns wrong, so I'm going to buy Alex a beer to say, I am sorry for getting your pronouns wrong. I am using Alex's name rather than pronouns to describe Alex. So that's a quick primer on pronouns. Like I said, there's over 30 pronouns, gender-neutral pronouns in the English language alone. You can actually pull that up. You can search for it online and say gender-neutral pronoun list. Actually, surprisingly, Wikipedia has a fantastic resource on gender-neutral pronouns. So I have, go ahead and hit it one more time. I have a quick exercise for us. And I'm actually going to save this for when we do the breakout sessions. So you have homework for your breakout session. You are going to turn to one person in your breakout session before you start your conversation, and you're going to ask them what pronouns they use. Because how do we know what pronouns somebody uses? It's okay to ask. It is. So one of the ways, the first time I was ever asked about my pronouns in a public setting was the wrong way to ask about pronouns, and it was somebody who turned to me and said, hey, are you a he or a she? Ouch, not quite right. I find the best way to ask is actually to combine step 2 here, which is to introduce your pronouns. Hi, my name is Mason. I use he, him, or they, them, theirs pronouns. It's lovely to meet you. Who are you? And by introducing your pronouns, it oftentimes will prompt somebody to introduce their pronouns. But if that isn't prompted, if you introduce yourself with your pronouns and somebody says, huh, what? Well, that's a great teachable moment. And it's okay to ask and say, by the way, I want to make sure I'm using appropriate language to describe you. What pronouns do you use? Some of you may have heard the term, what pronouns do you prefer? We're trying to move away from that language. My pronouns aren't my preference, they're mine. They're my identity. They communicate essential information about me. And so my pronouns are he, him, or they, them. My pronouns are not preferred, they are mine. So this is some quick either homework for your breakout sessions or continue this on. I encourage you to introduce your pronouns when you meet new people, because for people like me, maybe where I use they, them, theirs pronouns exclusively, it is always on me to introduce my pronouns and to defend and articulate, because people don't assume to use they, them, theirs pronouns with me yet. When you, as a cisgender ally, introduce your pronouns, you're taking the onus away from trans people by saying, I have pronouns too, and I want those respected just like any person, including trans people. So I highly encourage, whether it's you're introducing yourself in a congregational meeting, many people put their pronouns on their name tags. If future possibilities for you as well, to put your pronouns on name tags like what you're wearing tonight. All of these are opportunities for you to be an ally by saying we all have pronouns and we all deserve respect for those pronouns. Some other quick recommendations for you specifically around pronouns. The first, when I don't know what pronouns to use for a person, maybe I haven't had the opportunity to privately and compassionately and empathetically ask what pronouns a person uses, I will default to they, them, theirs, because I don't want to make an assumption. Just because somebody dresses in a masculine way doesn't mean that that person uses he, him, and his pronouns. And so I default to they, them, theirs, and then follow up by asking. Including your pronouns in all your introductions. We've covered that. Got there. Done. All right. Mistakes happen. I messed up somebody's pronouns right in front of you, and it happens. I do this work professionally, and I mess up somebody's pronouns every day. When you make a mistake, do not melt down. I have had so many people who literally leave voicemails on my phone. I messed up my child's pronouns. I need to come to your next Trans 101. I am the worst. No, you're not the worst. It's okay. When you make a mistake around somebody's names or pronouns, apologize and move on. Because when you have that meltdown, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, I messed up your pronouns. I know it's just hard and I'm struggling with it. You're centering yourself and you're making it about you, when it should be about respect for the people around you. So when you make that mistake, apologize. I'm so sorry, I messed up your pronouns. But follow up that apology by saying, I'll do better next time. And then do the work to do better next time. Examine and replace unnecessary gendered language. Boy, when I walk into rooms and people say, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here tonight. This is not a three-ring circus. And I am not a lady nor a gentleman, so I guess I'll see you later. I don't need to be here. Examining and replacing that unnecessary gendered language is a really great way to do it. How do we do this? Well, there's so many ways. Just saying, hello everyone, thank you for being here tonight. In educational settings where people say boys and girls, everybody sit down. I actually went to a Quaker elementary school and everybody was friends. Good morning, friends. Let's all sit down, pay attention. For those educators out there, that's a great term to use. But there are so many other ways to take gendered language out of our daily interactions. The last quick recommendation is editing your email signature. So I have my email signature here. Hit it one more time for me. There we go. Oh boy, it's small. This is my email signature. I put my pronouns in my email signature so people know how to address me. I was doing this workshop at MIT a while ago, and they loved this at MIT because they said, we work with people from other communities, other cultures where we don't know the gender assumptions of names. And so by putting our pronouns in our email signatures, other people in other communities and countries that they are working with will also do that, so we can now clarify what pronouns people use with people that we never meet in person. I mean, how many people do you email with and never actually meet in person? All the time now, right? Now you know what pronouns to use for those people by putting it in your email signature. So that's a helpful, handy-dandy tip. All right. I want to briefly talk about this because it's really important today. I'm bumping a little bit into the breakout session time, but this is extremely, extremely important. Yeah. So as I mentioned, tomorrow is the International Transgender Day of Remembrance. It's a day where people all across the globe will gather to recognize and read the names of transgender people who have been murdered in the last year. This year, it's over 300 names that we read, or we'll be reading tomorrow. And the vast, overwhelming majority of the names that we read every year are transgender women of color, particularly Black transgender women here in the U.S. The almost 30 transgender people that we lost in the U.S. to murder, and it's almost 30, are all transgender women of color. And so we have to understand that when we are working towards allyship for trans identities, we can't just be an ally to trans folks and let it end there. We have to work on and address racism in the world around us, because it is not just transgender women, it is transgender women of color. And it's sexism as well, because it's transgender women. And it is women who are being attacked, who are being harassed, who are being killed because of their gender identity. And so as we work towards allyship and think about allyship, we have to say, what am I doing to be an ally to trans people? What am I doing to be an ally as a white person for people of color? What am I doing to be an ally to women? What am I doing to break down sexism and misogyny, racism, as well as transphobia. And these are just some of the faces of the transgender women we've lost in the last year and a half. And sadly, there are more and more every day. I actually brought with me today at Keshet, we have yard site candles for the Transgender Day of Remembrance that we are asking people to light tomorrow in honor of the Transgender Day of Remembrance and take a picture of and share on social media if you have it, so that we can recognize and learn more and spread that awareness for the transgender people who have been taken from us in the last year. My hope every year is that we don't have to have a Transgender Day of Remembrance next year. I'll be honest with you, I dread tomorrow because I know we are reading more names of people that I know, people that I don't know, people who I wish I had gotten the opportunity to know. So please, tomorrow, if you're interested in taking, I have a whole bunch here, maybe one per family if you're interested, but please light a candle. Maybe look up the names of some of the transgender women who have been murdered and hold those names in your heart and in memory tomorrow. So what are we, go ahead and next slide here. What are we doing to, maybe? Yeah, okay. What are we doing to address discrimination and bias in our world today? I am a lawyer, so I'm going to talk about some of the legal aspects and what we're doing for trans rights. Here in Massachusetts, we have some amazing progress for transgender rights. We have non-discrimination protections on the basis of gender identity in employment, housing, education, credit lending, and thanks to the Yes on 3 campaign, we have secured those rights on the ballot for public accommodations. And that's great, but remember to my earlier comments, legal equality is not lived equity. We have those rights, we have those laws. It doesn't mean that discrimination and bias and violence have just gone away. We have to do that work to educate ourselves and educate people around us to really make sure that those non-discrimination laws are utilized and people are held accountable to their discrimination and bias against transgender people. So we have those rights in Massachusetts. We also, last week, finally, after 6 years of advocacy at the RMV, I finally got through to them, and we have non-binary gender markers on state IDs. We're one of 16 states that have non-binary markers on state IDs. Yes?
Rhode Island is also pushing for that.
Yep, Rhode Island is pushing for that. New Hampshire will go into effect January 1 of 2020. California, Oregon, Washington, Washington, D.C., I think Michigan just passed this week a non-binary gender marker on state IDs as well, which is great. Massachusetts is actually one of the few states where we now have gotten rid of any medical requirement to change a gender marker on ID. We have what's called self-attestation, which simply means I check the box that I know myself to be, and I don't have to get a doctor or a therapist or any other person to sign off on it because I am the expert in my identity, not somebody else, which is great. Healthcare, we have healthcare non-discrimination protections. We have Mass Health is required to cover transition-related healthcare for those who seek it or need it, as well as private insurance, so long as it is not self-funded, is required to provide coverage for transition-related care for transgender people. Self-funded insurance is a whole other bag of tricks that we are working on, but it is really important, and we're one of very few states that actually has those protections as well. But that's Massachusetts. What happens if I travel to Texas? What happens if I travel to Montana? What happens if I travel to some other state? Well, we don't have federal protections at the same level, but we are working on those. In October of this year, we had the Supreme Court heard a case about transgender non-discrimination in employment and whether or not Title VII covers gender identity under the designation of sex. Does sex cover gender identity? The Supreme Court heard those cases October 8th and will be issuing a decision in June of next year. Really important stuff. Hopefully we'll hear more about that and it'll all be positive and great. However, if it doesn't go well, or even if it does go well, we are working on also what's known as the Equality Act. The Equality Act is a federal piece of legislation which will push for achieve non-discrimination protections for gender identity and sexual orientation in not just employment, but also in public accommodations and housing and health care. The Equality Act actually has been on the table and been proposed since 1974. We've been at this for a while. We are working hard. We actually got further this year than we ever have before, and it passed the House for the first time since 1974, which is a really big deal. And we know that hopefully we can get it past the Senate at some point, hopefully in my lifetime. That'd be nice. Fingers crossed. We also have we had educational protections. Those unfortunately have been removed, and we are hopefully going to include that in future iterations of the Equality Act. And unfortunately, while transgender people were allowed to serve in the military for a short amount of time between 2016 and 2018, we are now no longer allowed to serve in the military, but there are many court cases that are taking that on to say that transgender people have the rights and responsibilities associated with all different forms of office, and that includes the right to serve in the military for those who want it. All of these are federal protections that we are working on. Here in Massachusetts, like I said, we have some great protections, but there's still so much work to be done, not just in states, but at the federal level as well. So with that, I only went over 10 minutes over, but we are going to now go into our breakout sections. I have some quick study thoughts for you that you will also have some facilitation to talk about, but some quick parting thoughts. What are we doing to address bias and discrimination in our world and in our communities? What are we doing to address transphobia and racism and sexism and other forms of discrimination and bias? How can we work to be allies to trans and non-binary people in our daily lives? What is something that you can do tonight, tomorrow, future days and weeks to be an ally to transgender people? If we get to it, great. How does the media and/or trans policies, like what I just talked about at the federal level, influence our awareness of trans and non-binary identities? Can you name a transgender character in a book or TV show? Why or why not? And what other aspects of that are really important for representation? And what are the next steps for my allyship? How will I bring others with me in that journey to be an ally to transgender people? I really appreciate you being here tonight, for having this conversation, and for continuing this conversation in some smaller breakout sessions. Great.